welcome back to the stillness. The deep quiet, reserved only for those who truly listen, the hour where the world outside seems to hold its breath, allowing the whispers of the past to drift into the present. I am here, as always, deep in the heart of the archive, a place of perpetual twilight, where the air is heavy with the scent of aged paper and the knowledge of things that should have remained buried. And tonight, I've brought something to the surface. Not a creature you can fight with a knife, not a specter you can banish with a prayer, but something far more insidious, something much colder, more precise, something born of human intention and human fear. Something written. I have been trying to decipher this file for what feels like a lifetime. It is classified under a symbol that I have only ever seen once before, a broken circle, and the faded year, 1978. It is impossibly heavy, bound not with string but with thick, simple twine, and it exudes a terrible aroma. It smells distinctly of ozone and the deep chemical bitterness of utter regret, as if the paper itself has been exposed to a concentrated lightning strike of agonizing understanding. The moment I opened it, I knew precisely why it was locked away. It is not merely a record. It is an account of a peculiar kind of psychological warfare, a slow, deliberate, and entirely successful dismantling of a human mind for profit. The file's subject, Elias Thorne, was not a government operative or a forgotten scientist, as many of our entries reveal. He was simply a patient number 743, confined to the Blackwood Sanatorium in 1978. He went by Caleb, preferring the simple, grounded strength of that name to the more academic, complex sound of Elias. But names, as you will see, were the least of the things that were deceptive at Blackwood. Blackwood wasn't built for healing. It was designed purely for containment. A sprawling, imposing structure of white tile, cold steel, and endless echoing corridors that stretched the sight and strained the ear. The atmosphere was a strange, unsettling chemical cocktail, smelling perpetually of stale institutional bleach, cheap antiseptic soap, and something indefinable, something metallic, like old pennies left out in the rain, or perhaps the scent of fear itself. The lights were always buzzing, always too bright, leaving no corner for comfort or true darkness. Caleb was there for an anxiety disorder that had, according to the official report, spiraled into what the physicians officially labeled as extreme paranoia. He couldn't trust the floor beneath him, the ceiling above, or the air he breathed. Every gesture from a nurse was a code. Every change in their schedule was a trap. Every meal was a poison test. But here is where our file begins its terrible twist. Caleb was observant, too observant, pathologically so. He didn't just feel paranoid. He meticulously documented it. He was a creature of habit and vigilance, paying painful attention to the routines, the fleeting expressions of the nurses, and especially the other patients, the ones who shuffled, whispered, or sometimes screamed their fractured truths in the main corridor alongside him. He was waiting for the undeniable proof that his paranoia was justified. He was waiting for the exact moment Blackwood would truly reveal itself as the cage he knew it to be. The proof arrived, not with a burst of violence or a grand revelation, but with a terrible, slow, and sickening silence. His journal records the first instance on a Tuesday morning. The air was crisp, the breakfast trays had rattled past, but the usual annoying scraping of a chair and the familiar humming in room 3B was missing. He notes that the man in 3B a quiet gentleman named Arthur, who believed his bones were made of impossibly delicate glass, was simply gone. Caleb asked the orderly. He asked the nurse on rounds. The answer was a practiced, single word, delivered with a flat, empty gaze that betrayed nothing. Transferred. They all said it the same way. Suddenly, in the night, with no warning. Caleb writes, "They said, transferred, but they wouldn't look at me. Their eyes seemed fixed on a point just over my shoulder, on the door behind me. The bed in 3B was stripped too quickly, almost violently so. The mattress still had a shallow valley, an indentation, a shadow of where Arthur used to lie, but all his belongings, his worn slippers, his cheap shaving kit, his single, treasured photograph of a lighthouse on a distant rocky shore, all gone. No one moves that fast in this place, unless they are desperately trying to hide the speed itself." He felt a cold, calculated wedge being driven into his already fragile calm. Arthur had not been moved. He had simply dissolved. A week later, the wedge was driven deeper, with more brutal force. It was Miss Delacroix from 5A. She was a loud woman, a constant theatrical force of nature, convinced she was the queen of the Atlantic, and demanded that the nurses provide saline solution for her daily tea. Her booming, opera-like presence vanished overnight. Her absence was felt immediately, replaced by a dreadful, echoing silence where her terrible singing, however off-key, used to be. Again, the same two syllables, whispered like a curse. Transferred. This pattern continued, slow, discreet, and devastatingly effective. The population of the East Wing was shrinking, like a ship slowly and quietly taking on water. One patient a week, sometimes two. They were never taken on a Monday or a Friday. It was always midweek, during the lowest possible shift of staff, just after the 2 a.m. security rotation. The nurses and orderlies looked exhausted, their practiced smiles brittle, like thin layers of ice spread over deep, personal terror. Caleb began to chart the disappearances, not as patients but as variables in an equation he didn't yet understand. He used the margins of a smuggled crossword puzzle, numbering the rooms, meticulously noting the patient's most cherished delusion, and tracking the date and time of their final disappearance. He noticed one terrifying constant. They were always the most withdrawn patients, the ones with the most fantastic, elaborate delusions, the ones who, because their minds were already so far from accepted reality, were the easiest to forget, the ones who were the quietest when they were finally gone. Caleb realized he was running out of time. He knew he didn't have a fantastical delusion, only paranoia. But in a place where people vanished for their most protected secrets, paranoia suddenly felt like the only sane, rational state left. He decided he had to leave, not merely to escape the physical walls, but to escape the terrifying rationale for the disappearances that was rapidly solidifying in his mind. Tyne. He needed to find out where they were going before the nurse came for him with that clipboard and that flat, empty gaze. The only possibility, he recalled from a fleeting 2-minute moment of permitted yard time weeks ago, was the basement laundry service tunnel, a narrow, often flooded crawl space hidden behind the main kitchen utility closet. The night he chose was a Saturday, routine shift change, when the security check-ins were spaced 15 minutes apart. A heavy, insistent, hammering rain was battering the exterior windows of the East Wing, a relentless sound that he desperately hoped would mask the thin, metallic scraping of his homemade screwdriver on the old, rusted access hatch. He descended into the absolute darkness, squeezing through the tight hole, not knowing that he wasn't just escaping an asylum. He was descending into the terrifying mechanism of his own mind. The tunnel was impossibly damp and smelled strongly of mildew, old steam, and stagnant mop water. It was tight, punishingly so, forcing his chest against the cold, wet dirt. He moved slowly, agonizingly, counting his every breath, listening for any sign of a guard's bootstep above. After what felt like an hour of muscle-cramping effort, the crawlspace opened into a wider, vertical shaft, like an empty, abandoned cistern. The air here was strangely still, almost suffocatingly calm, but distinctly warmer than the tile rooms above, and it held a faint, sickly sweet smell he couldn't quite place. Caleb used his smuggled cigarette lighter. The tiny flame was weak, flickering desperately, casting dancing shadows that made the concrete walls look like moving, grotesque faces. And he saw it, scrawled into the thick dust on the concrete wall, written in something dark, viscous, and fully dried, a single, looping, terrible word: Rationale. He also saw why the air was warm. Ahead, the main tunnel branched into 3 separate, narrow, circular metal vents, like pipes leading out from a monstrous furnace. Each one was marked with a small, rusted placard: V1, the Queen's Throne; V2, the Glass Garden; V3, the Silent Place. The names were not random. They were chillingly specific. They were direct, horrifying references to the delusions of the vanished patients. The Queen of the Atlantic, Arthur with his glass bones, and a third, quieter patient named Peter, who believed he was slowly, agonizingly, turning invisible. Caleb stood there, the small light shaking in his hand, casting frantic, useless light. These weren't simply escape routes. They were destinations. Specific, personalized, terrible destinations, tailored to the deepest recesses of the minds of the people who had gone missing. He chose the Silent Place, V3. It was the narrowest, and therefore the least likely to be used by staff. He had to know if they were alive, if they were working, or if this was just a horrific, subterranean dumping ground for the inconvenient. He squeezed into the vent. The tunnels narrowed again, and the sweetness in the air became sickly, cloying, like burnt sugar mixed with old blood. He crawled for what felt like 30 minutes, his knees raw and his shoulders scraping the metal. Finally, the tunnel opened slightly into a low concrete room, small but wide enough to stand. It was empty, but not empty of evidence. The entire center of the floor was coated in a thin, black, oily residue, like spilled, dried ink, or perhaps the residue of some kind of rapid combustion. Around it, leaning haphazardly against the damp walls, were hundreds of small, square, leather-bound notebooks. Caleb grabbed the nearest one. The leather was supple, the pages pristine. It was Mr. Arthur's journal. The Man with the Glass Bones. Caleb flipped through the pages frantically. They were not scribbles about fragile skeletons. They were meticulous, precise notes on optics, light refraction, the tensile strength of composite materials, and the thermal properties of silica. Pages and pages of dense, brilliant, complex physics that detailed how to make an ultralight, diamond-hard, entirely transparent structure. He grabbed the second book, Miss Delacroix's. It was not about royalty. It was a complete, hand-drawn map of deep-sea currents, forgotten shipping lanes, and the deepest, most pressure-resistant trenches in the Pacific. A flawless, technical study of the Atlantic, not the Queen's domain, but a strategic asset. These were not mad ravings. They were highly technical, valuable intellectual properties that somehow related directly to their original delusion. The delusion was simply the key to the hidden truth. Then he found a tape recorder, slightly charred, resting on the floor next to a final empty notebook. He pressed play, holding the device to his ear. Narrator adopts a slightly different, more frantic and breathless voice for the audio log. "This is it. I'm finishing the equation. I've given them the Queen's coordinates. They said I'm sane now. I've solved the problem. The Queen needs her crown. If I solve the problem of the glass refraction, if I make the material perfect, transparent, strong, if I give them the answer to their Queen's throne, then I can leave. They promised. They promised the rationale is simple. We trade our truth for our freedom. They don't want us crazy. They want us focused. They want the hidden insight buried beneath the madness. They want the sharp, singular vision only madness can create." The voice cut off with a sudden, wet, terrible choking sound, and a sound like breaking glass that was immediately muffled. Caleb understood. A cold, terrible wave washed over him. Blackwood wasn't a prison for the mad. It was a mine for the brilliant. The delusions were simply the outer layer, the unique, protective shield their minds had built to protect the incredibly valuable, singular knowledge inside. The staff wasn't treating them. They were extracting the truth one by one, giving them a false hope of freedom as payment for the knowledge they held. The disappearances weren't murders. They were graduations. Once the hidden rationale, the solution to the problem buried beneath the delusion, was extracted, the patient, the person, was no longer needed. Their value was spent. He frantically picked up the last notebook lying near the tape recorder, the one belonging to the man who believed he was turning invisible. Caleb's own heart was hammering in his chest because he recognized the writing, the precise, elegant, obsessive script. It wasn't the invisible man's. It was his own. He flipped the cover, printed on the inside page with clinical precision. Patient 743, Elias Thorne. Caleb, delusion, extreme paranoia. He stared at the first page. It was a study, a complete, flawlessly constructed architectural plan, detailing every single structural weakness, every hidden vent, every single schedule overlap, and every single escape opportunity in the entire Blackwood Sanatorium. It was a perfect, tactical blueprint for breaking out. His paranoia wasn't a delusion. It was a cover, a brilliant, obsessive need to know the patterns of his prison. It was the valuable knowledge they had been waiting to extract. He was not escaping. He was executing the final stage of his own mind's design. The escape was not an act of rebellion. It was the rationale they had been waiting for him to deliver, the ultimate proof of his own unique mental architecture. Caleb dropped the journal. The leather cover made a heavy thud on the concrete. His head snapped up. He hadn't been breathing. He heard a soft sound of a lock clicking far, far above. He realized the rhythmic, soft shuffle he thought was a distant guard had stopped the exact moment he opened the final archivist's file. He was alone, in the dark, in a tunnel he had flawlessly designed and executed, but he wasn't free. He had simply delivered the final, most crucial piece of data to his captors. He didn't run. He just sat there, waiting in the cloying warmth of the extraction room, waiting for the team to descend and thank him for his brilliant, final plan. The file ends here, abruptly. No transfer note, no final log, The pen strokes just stop mid-sentence. The only thing left is a single, loose photograph tucked into the last page. It is a portrait of a smiling man in a neat white coat, standing proudly in front of the Blackwood Sanatorium sign, the chief physician. And pinned to his lapel, the same chilling symbol marked on the file, the broken circle. It wasn't broken. It was complete. They didn't break them. They just borrowed them. They didn't cure them. They just harvested the sharpest, most terrifying truths buried inside the fragile architecture of the human mind. The truths that could only be generated by a mind pushed to the very edge of sanity. The archivist closes the book. The sound of the heavy leather cover sealing is a terrifying finality. And now the stillness returns. The night is listening, but are you truly ready to hear it? If the shadows in the corner of your room are starting to feel a little too sharp, and if you realize your most bizarre thoughts might actually be your most valuable insights, then subscribe and turn on notifications. You can't escape what you don't know, and you can't unknow what you have been told. Good night. Sleep well, and remember, the deepest secrets are the ones you keep from yourself.